Thank you, everyone, for joining us at the conference. Again, this has been a fabulous schus for us to host Agon Rav Asher, and we'll get to hear from him today for a penultimate here with on organ donation after cardiac death.
So this is the last year at the Chemed conference, Tovshin Pei Hey, and I hope the next conference will be with a bigger crowd in Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, and you're all invited. I think next year in Yerushalayim it'll be for free of cost, hopefully. And it was a big schus. So anifta mechavero yal yapota memeno ele metoich dvar alocha. And to me it was a privilege and yehirot, so we should be able to all keep it up and deal with very serious questions that come up. And especially our session today is dealing with what might be a substantial breakthrough. I will not pasken halacha lamaisa this morning. I think to give halacha lamaisa psak, I don't think this is the right forum. And the issue we're dealing with is an extremely sensitive issue, and there are many considerations besides the fundamental halachic analysis. And therefore, what we'll do today is just explain the issue, and it's dodem lekan ulechan, but I will not leave you with a psak. This is an issue I need to address with the relevant forums. But the sugya is a fascinating one. So regarding organ donations, I just want to give a brief comment. For many years, the film community was attacked saying, you don't donate organs. You're not compassionate. You don't care about people that are dying. But in recent years, since we have enabled live kidney donors, the film community taps the entire world, not by 5%, by 10%, but by 100%. And the film community donates more kidneys, live donors, than any other community in the world. And when people ask me, I make it clear to people, you're not mechuyev. You are not obliged to give away a kidney. Principle number 2, your kidney belongs to your wife as well. And you need her total consent. And if a woman wants to donate a kidney, I say your kidney is not only yours, it's your husband's as well. And if your spouse has any hesitation or any doubt, you cannot donate a kidney. But if you're both 100% on the same page, I cannot imagine any greater chesed. Giving away a kidney is more than giving away $10 million or whatever it is. So I think it is a testament to our compassion and our caring. I know so many from people that donated kidneys not to siblings, not to family members, but to total strangers. And many times I was involved, not in convincing people to donate a kidney, but encouraging them if they decided and giving them chizuk. And I think this is an amazing testament to the compassion and the caring and the chesed of our community. Dealing with heart transplants or lung transplants, which cannot be utilized during the life of a person, only after his demise, this is an extremely touchy and sensitive and complicated halachic issue. And the basis of this discussion is brain death. Do we recognize brain death? How do we define death? So what has recently come up is a new development, which is DCD, donation after cardiac death or circulatory death. It's the same, just different terminology. And there are two different systems. In American medical institutions, we're dealing with controlled DCD, which definitely is not permissible according to halacha, because we stop the ventilator, and there are many things we do before cardiac arrest, because the objective is to take his heart and lungs, and that is impossible after spontaneous cardiac arrest. So what we're dealing with primarily in Israel is the possibility of, after total cardiac arrest and resuscitation for an extended period, as the protocol is, and then a standoff period, which we define in Israel as 10 minutes of no touch, and then having another team, trying to take out kidneys. So after cardiac arrest and 20 or 30 minutes of resuscitation and 10 minutes of no touch, it is impossible to use the heart or lungs, but there might be a possibility to harvest kidneys and maybe in the future even the liver. And that is our present discussion. What is death? I don't think anybody knows. And at the end of Sefer Eov, when Eov cries out from the depth of his pain, and suddenly he has a revelation, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears for Eov, and he asks him some fundamentally piercing questions. Eifo hayita biozdi aretz, hagedna im yodato bino. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks him, haniglu lacha sharei moves, v'sharei tzel mavet tir'eh. So the question is, do Chazal define death? Let's examine. There are two sugyas to deal. One is a person considered dead. One is a Mishnah in the very first Perek in Ohalois, dealing with Tumas Nevela, and maybe Tumas Meis as well. And the other is a sugya dealing with Chilul Shabbos in Yom Pei Hei. What do you have in Mishnah in Ohalois? Behema, ve'oif, hutaz roisham. If the head was severed from the body, the head was cut off, afal pishem efarkes, even though the body is still thrashing around, the metamet tumas nevela. Is this only an animal, or would the same rule apply to a human being? The Rambam, Hilchas Tumas Meis Perek Aleph Halacha Tezvav, quotes this halacha referring to a human being as well. When we're dealing with an animal, we're dealing with Tumas Nevela. With a human being, we're dealing with Avi Avois Tumah, and that is Tumas Meis. So the Mishnah in Ohala said, when the head is severed from the body, then it is quite clear that the person is dead. Even though you still have motion and the body is thrashing around, that are just reflexes, but that does not equal life. So the Mishnah Masechet Olas deals with Dinei Tumah v'Tahara, either Tumas Nevela when we're dealing with animals, or Tumas Meis when we're dealing with a human being. The other sugya is in Yom Pei Hei. A house imploded, and that happens, earthquakes, terror attacks, and people are buried under the debris, under the rubble. And we uncover a part of a human body. How much do we need to uncover to verify, is the person alive? As long as he's alive, it justifies Chilul Shabbos. After his demise, it no longer justifies Chilul Shabbos. There's a machlokes in the Gemara. Boidek ad liboi or ad apoi? Do we need to uncover his heart and see whether there's heartbeat? Or does it depend on pulmonary function? And we check his nose. Actually, there are two different gersoas, two different versions in the Gemara, ad libor or ad taburoi. Is it his stomach or his heart? And his stomach, pulmonary function is more obvious. We see whether the lungs are, whether his body is moving, lung function. If it's the heart, we check whether there's heartbeat. Or maybe we check his nose. The Rambam paskins, and that seems to be the maskon of the Gemara, Peridala Dalachayutas of El Chashabis, we need to check his nose, and we put a feather next to his nose. If there is no breathing, then we assume he's dead. So these are the two only sugyas in which we deal with life and death. And the relevant question is, do Chazal mean to define death? Or just when could we assume that a person is no longer alive? Is this assumption or a definition? Scientifically, death is a process. And many hours after a person is medically declared dead, his nails still grow and his hair still grows. So death, scientifically, is a process. And would a person be considered alive if his hair is growing or his nails are growing? Chazal say, no breath, he's no longer alive. Does that mean breath is life? Vayipach ba'apov nishmas chayim, like the Pusik in Bereshis, in the days of creation would seem to indicate. Or the Chazal merely mean to say, if a person no longer breathes, we assume that he is no longer alive. That is irreversible, and we assume he is no longer alive. So 320 years ago, there was a huge machlokes in the halachic world, a question that to us would seem somewhat amusing. A girl opened a chicken to kasher the chicken, and she took the belly of the chicken, the guts, and she threw it to a cat. And then she realized this chicken has no heart. Is it kosher or treifa? A chicken without a heart, kosher or treifa? The Mishnah in Perek Treifa says, Nika v'lev, if the heart is punctured, if there's a hole in the heart, then it's treifa, and it is prohibited for consumption. So what is the din if a chicken has no heart? So in the Kehilas of Altona, Hamburg, Würzburg, there were two Rabbanim, which is an interesting phenomenon. The Chacham Tzvi and the Moshe Rothenburg. And the agreement was, in Israel we have this all the time in the political arena. Rotation. 6 months, each of the Rabbonim, of these two Rabbonim, are thereof. The Chacham Tzvi paskined that the chicken is kosher. Why? Because no living creature could live without a heart. Though there's no such a thing that this chicken didn't have a heart. Until the shchita was running around, how could that be? So obviously it is clear as daylight that when the girl threw some of the internal organs to the cat, mistakenly, she threw the heart as well. Because this is impossible that a living creature, that a chicken, runs around without a heart. Rav Moshe Rothenberg said, this is a wrong psak, and if a chicken doesn't have a heart, kal v'chomer nika v'lev treifa, kal v'chomer nital halev. And the fundamental argument is, could a chicken run around without a heart? We know some heartless human beings, but maybe there is no such a thing as a heartless chicken. So this was an interesting machlokes. The Tumim, the Placey, was a younger man, and he also voiced his opinion. And he paid dearly for voicing his opinion, but that is more historical discussion, which we might talk about in another time. And he came out against the Chacham Tzvi. And the Chacham Tzvi lost his job because the Moshe Rothenberg came out against him. And then the Tumim, Rabbi Yonis and Eibishis, was elected to be the Rav in the place of the Chacham Tzvi. And Rabbi Yankov Emden, the son of the Chacham Tzvi, was extremely upset about this development. So Rabbi Yonis and Eibishis said, the Chacham Tzvi is right. A chicken cannot live without a heart. But maybe the heart was deformed, and one of the other internal organs functioned instead of a heart, and therefore it's treifa. Comes along the Chazon Ish after 250 years, and Yoredei Siman Daled, and the Chazon Ish says, if any other organ functioned as a heart, then that's a heart. And the halacha does not dictate exactly how a heart looks or works. So obviously the chicken had a heart, and if it had a heart, then he's kosher. Why do I discuss this interesting controversy? Because the Chacham Tzvi writes two lengthy tshuvas, Siman Ayin Daled and Ayin Zayin, and he insists that life is heartbeat, and the essence of life is the heart. And he bases this opinion primarily on the Zohar, which is part of the controversy. Could we prove halacha from the Zohar? And the Chacham Tzvi in his lengthy tshuva quotes the sugya in Yume Pehei. How do we define that a person is dead? And he argues, everybody agrees that it depends on heartbeat. But if there is no breath, no pulmonary function, then there cannot be cardiac function. So this is a discussion 300 years ago. And we know today far more than we knew about biology and medicine then. The Chacham Tzvi quotes the Ibn Ezra. What is the function of the lung? We know today what the function of the lung is, but the Ibn Ezra writes that the lung is there to cool off the heart. The heart shouldn't become too hot because it's constantly beating and friction causes heat. So the lung brings in air. It's a cooler system for the heart. And therefore the Chacham Tzvi says, if there is no lung function, then the heart will burn out. And therefore, life depends on the heart. And the Chacham Tzvi deals with our sugya. But the pashtus of the sugya is life depends on breath. So, Tshuvas Chasam Sefer Siman Shin Lamed Ches. And we go down, move forward, fast forward more than 100 years. The Chasam Sefer deals with complaints that were against the Jewish community and Jewish rulers. And in Austria in those days, the law was you need to wait 24 hours before burying a person because you might be making a mistake and maybe he is alive and he just seemed to you to be dead. And they said, Jews are reckless and they might be burying live people. And the Chasam Sofer writes, Torah Hashkof. And here the Chasam Sofer is considered a makel and not a machmir. The Chasam Sofer writes there are three criteria. Ke'even doimim, motionless. Ein defika, which means no pulse and no breath. The Chasam Sofer comes up with three different criteria. Motion, pulse, breath. Where does he come from? Where do we find in Chazal? The machlokes is either heartbeat or breath, ad liboy or apoy. According to Chacham Tzvi, it all depends on your heart. The breath is just to verify that there is no longer heart function, because if the lungs aren't working, the heart can't work. Well, even with what we know today, these two organs are intertwined. If there's no breath, if the lung isn't functioning, then the heart isn't getting purified blood, and if the heart isn't beating, then the lungs will have no blood. But the Chasam Sofer requires three different criteria. Even doimim, but we quoted the Mishnah in Ohalas. Even if the body is thrashing around, still is considered dead. Tumas meis. So that is when a head was cut off or severed, and that causes the central nervous system a reflex. But when a person dies, not in a traumatic way, but meis al mitosoi, then there is no thrashing about. So the Chassam Sofer requires three different criteria. The way I understand the Chassam Sofer is, Chazal determined in their day, when could we assume that a person is no longer alive? And the Chassam Sofer says, regarding Chilul Shabbos, if there is no breath, then you can no longer be Mechalel Shabbos. But if you want to verify with clarity and certainty that a person is no longer alive and he could be taken to burial, then we need additional verification, and that is motion, heartbeat, and breath. Only the three, the combination of the three, would enable us to bury a person. So the way I understand the Chassam Sofer, yes, Chazal deal not with the definition of death. Haniglu lacha sharei mavet. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what life is, and only HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows exactly what is death. The sugya deals, when do we assume that a person is no longer alive? And therefore the Chassam Sofer says, we need to do the best we can. There might be a difference between Thomas Mace. There might be a difference between Chilul Shabbos to save a life or burying a person. When we bury a person, we need to be 100% convinced and with certainty that he is no longer alive. And therefore, the Chassam Sofer comes up with additional criteria that we do not find in the Gemara. And that is the triple criteria of the Chassam Sofer. No motion, no pulse, and no neshima. So one of the questions we need to deal with, cardiac arrest. So according to the Gemara, you check his nose. No breath, we assume he's dead. But neither Chazal nor the Rishonim deal, how long do you need to examine whether there is no breath? There are hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions of people in the world that had no breath, no heartbeat, for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, for 50 minutes, and they were brought back. And I would not assume that the average paramedic, and there are many paramedics in this room, that did resuscitation and saved people's lives, I do not assume that they performed Tchiyas HaMesim. To perform Tchiyas HaMesim, you need to be a huge, huge tzaddik. And since the days of the Ameroim and the Tanoim, Rabbi Vereb Zera is a story in Megillah Dav Zayin. Ksubah Samech Beis, we find Reb Hananya ben Chakinui, after 12 years in yeshiva, came home. His wife passed away and he did Tchiyas HaMesim. I doubt the average paramedic, and they're all tzaddikim, but they don't do Tchiyas HaMesim. So we should assume that even though for an extended period there was no pulse and no pulmonary function, many people could still survive and be revived. So we must assume Chazal in their days didn't determine how long do we need to examine his nose and see that there is no breath. What I mean to point out is there might be a difference between Tumas Meis and Chilul Shabbos, and to determine with certainty that the person is no longer alive. So there might be a stage in which we no longer need to resuscitate because it seems to be futile. But is it necessarily right to clamp off the blood flow to the brain, cut him up, take out his kidneys at a relatively early stage? Resuscitation isn't working. But could we determine with a level of certainty that he is dead, and if he would be alive, to kill him? Because in this process, they clamp off the arteries leading blood to the brain because they want maximum blood flow to the lower part of the body, and they don't want to lose blood flow. And so this is one of the questions we need to deal with, bearing in mind that Chazal, in my opinion, didn't really define death, but rather dealt with the question, when could we assume that a person is no longer alive? there might be a difference in assuming he's no longer alive and no longer permitting Chilul Shabbos. We might be entitled to assume he's no longer alive and no longer try to resuscitate because it seems to be futile, but it's not necessarily permissible to assume that he is no longer alive, and if he would be alive, directly to kill him and cause his demise. That is one of the questions we will need to address. More than 200 years ago, the poskim dealt with the question, when is it permissible to perform nivel hameis, to cut up a person and do an autopsy and remove his organs, hoping to save other people? The very first source is the Noida B'Yehuda. Madura Tenyoni Yoredea Simereishu. The Noida B'Yehuda deals with a case. Two people were in a hospital and both seemed to have the same illness. One died. The other is still desperately ill. And the doctors want to cut up the dead person and examine his internal organs. We don't know what it was. The kidneys, the liver, the heart, the lungs, internal organs. And the doctors feel if they could examine the one that just died, they might be able to save the other one that seemed to suffer the same ailment. And the Noida B'Yehuda says, no, that cannot be permitted. There's some Soifen, some in Shin Lamed Vav deals with a similar question, but just a different scenario. Person wanted to donate his body to research. Would that be permissible? There's some Soifen, the Noida B'Yehuda both say that you cannot violate Kvod HaMeis unless there's a Choyle B'Faneinu and you think you could save him, not for research. And the likelihood that by examining the organs of the deceased person, we will not be able to save the living person, and this is a process that maybe in the future we could save lives. So the fundamental argument of the Chassam Sofer and the Noida B'Yehuda is saving lives in the future does not permit violating halacha. Why not? So this is where the concept of choyle befaneinu comes in. So both the Noida B'Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer says, if a choyle befaneinu, then we need to be machal Shabbos, permit achila b'yom kippurim to save a life. But just advancing research, saving lives in the future, does not permit violating any prohibition, whether min haTorah or midrabanan, whether biblical or rabbinical. Interesting, Tshuva Machne Chaim was a disciple of the Chassam Sofer, Reb Chaim Sofer. They share the same family name, but they were not relatives. Chelik Beis Yoredea Simesamach. He comes up with a surprising argument, and he says to him, it is clear that the Chassam Sofer and the Noida B'Yehuda just were afraid of a slippery slope. But if we would in certainty know that we could save lives in the future by being machal Kvod HaMeis, it is clear to him there is no difference between present and future that would permit violating even the Weiss and not only the Rabbanon. The Chazon Ish seems to say something similar, but the Chazon Ish doesn't try to oppose his opinion on the Chassam Sofer. The Machne Chaim was a Talmud of the Chassam Sofer, so he dared. But the Chazon Ish argues it does not depend whether choyle befaneinu. The choyle might be 1,000 miles away. It depends on the level of reasonability that violating a Isser now would save lives in the future. Medical research, the Chazon Ish justifiably writes, medical research, you never know in advance where it's going to lead. Well, there are amazing breakthroughs, but so many leads lead nowhere. So just advancing medical research would not justify violating any Isser, especially usually for medical research there are no lack of bodies for anatomy research. So The Chassam Sofer and the Noid deal with Nivul Hameis, desecrating one's body, which is an Aveda, to maybe save lives in the future. So Chole B'Feneinu doesn't mean he's in the next room. And today we with the means of refrigeration and transportation, sometimes an organ is flown 100 miles away or 1,000 miles away to save a life. And usually when an organ is removed, we know exactly in advance who is the recipient. So this is an ongoing halachic discussion. We find correspondence between the Aruch LaNer and the Maramshik. They were contemporaries 150 years ago. The Aruch LaNer was Rav Yankov Ettlinger, Rav of Altona in Germany. The Maramshik was one of the disciples of the Chassam Sofer in Hungary. And the Aruch LaNer initiated a periodical, a Torah journal named Shomer Tzion HaNe'eman. And he wrote an article in that journal. The Maramshik, Yoredei Shum Mem Zayin, writes a letter to the Aruch LaNer rejecting what he wrote. The Aruch LaNer responds in his Shuvas, Kuf Ayin. The Maramshik answers, Shin Mem Ches. Aruch LaNer responds again in Kuf Ayin Aleph. So we have 3 letters from the Aruch LaNer and 2 from the Maramshik. What is their discussion? The Aruch LaNer writes, it is a total prohibition to remove organs even if we know that these organs would be transplanted or in any way. They're not dealing with transplantation because there was no ability 150 years ago to transplant organs. Once again, they're dealing with research. But the Aruch LaNer writes 2 fundamental assumptions. A person is not allowed to save his life by taking any possession or money that belonged to another person. Assumption number 1. And therefore, we have no rights to take away the organs of a mace. They are his, and that is Geneva. Assumption number 2. A mace is potem in a mitzvah. So the deceased has no mitzvah to save a life. And if he is poter and his organs are his, then we cannot take organs from a body to save another life, even though we know 100% with certainty that that life could be saved. The Maramshik rejects both assumptions. And Amikas Osher, I clearly agreed with the Maramshik. Mutar lahatel atzmai b'momen chaveiroi. If pikuach nefesh overrides any other Isser Torah, it overrides lo tignoiv and lo tigzoil as well. You need to compensate that person when you took away his money to save your life. But it definitely is mutar to take other people's money to save a life. You just need to repay. So he rejects assumption number 1 of the Aruch LaNer. Assumption number 2, the deceased has no chiyuv to save a life, but we have that chiyuv. And therefore we will take an organ to save the life of another. So the Aruch LaNer and the Maramshik both deal with the situation in which the deceased did not voice his opinion that he wants to donate an organ. If he voiced his opinion that he wishes to donate, then this argument would be totally invalid, irrelevant. So I'm just discussing the various sources going back hundreds of years in which Gedalim dealt fundamentally with similar questions. Coming back to our discussion, as I said in the beginning of my shir today, I will not give a definitive psak. I'm just pointing to the relevant questions and the most troubling aspect, besides considerations that are not 100% halachic criteria. So many years ago, when brain death became a definitive study, there was Harvard criteria. How do we define and determine brain death? But today in America, every medical facility determines brain death the way he wishes, and there is no clear set of rules dictated by law. in Israel, the law does dictate how do we define brain death, but there always is the risk of a slippery slope. Bearing in mind that the people that do organ transplantation are not bad people. They want to save lives. And from their perspective, when death is imminent, it's irreversible, and there no longer is a chance really to bring back a person, then what really their initiative is to save lives. So they're not murderers and they're not bad people. But from the halachic point of view, we need to be very concerned of what we define as a slippery slope. What happened in defining brain death might happen in defining cardiac or circulatory death as well, and that is a real consideration. And the other question is, bearing in mind my opinion, we do not know what death is, and Chazal deal, at what stage could we assume a person is no longer alive? And what we do with that assumption might differ. Tumas Meis Lachud, Chilul Shabbos Lachud, just stop trying to resuscitate Lachud, but at a relatively early stage after his demise, doing things that would definitely and immediately kill a person if he would be alive, that might be another question. So on my Sefer Minchas Rosh on Corona, I dealt with a very troubling question of that period. A person left in his will, and he told his children, if he dies during this epidemic, then one of the two, either he should be cremated or his body should be given to medical research trying to conquer this hill, this mountain, the COVID pandemic. And the children, who weren't very religious, they said, we want to follow our Father's will. What is recommended? Cremation or donating his body to medical research? And I had to decide between two evils, between two prohibitions. And I tried to convince them to bring his body to burial, but that was out of the question. That's against our Father's will, and all I needed to advise, either cremate the body or donate it to medical research. And my psak was medical research, promising that the majority of his body would be brought to burial, and even those organs that might be taken to medical research, if possible, they should at some stage be returned to the body and brought to burial. Partial burial is better than cremation. So that was my psak on a very troubling question. 200 years ago, or less than 200 years ago, I think it was in the 1920s, somewhat more than 100 years ago, many Rabbonim in Germany signed a letter, and one of the Rabbonim in Germany wrote a kuntris that no Chevra Kedisha should bury the ashes of people that were cremated, because, you know, in the time of reform, more and more Jews went for cremation, and that was a takona. It caused quite a stir, but on that letter, many of the greatest Gedolim of the time were signed, amongst them the Beis Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkes, and Reb Chaim Oizer. I once gave a psak, and I turned to a frum Chevra Kedisha to bury ashes. What was the story? A Holocaust survivor left in his will, and his children were shocked to discover that. He wrote in his will, his parents perished in Auschwitz, and they were burnt. So out of empathy or feeling, he thought he's giving cover to his parents, he asked as well to be cremated. He never spoke about this with his children, and his children were shocked. Most of his kids weren't frum. The frum one said, our father made a terrible and tragic mistake. He thought this will be an honor to his parents, but it's wrong, and we want to bury him. He was not very frum, but he was mesorti. You know, he was fundamentally Yerei Shamayim. He kept some mitzvahs. But the majority of his kids said, no, this is what our father wanted, and he was cremated. And I said to Krebbe Kiddush, this is not an atheist, and he didn't prefer cremation because he doesn't believe in Torah. He doesn't believe. He tragically, mistakenly thought that this is the way to honor his parents. So the Krebbe Kiddush did bury his ashes. And I had a precedent. If you ever visited the cemetery in Krakow, look for the caver of Reb Shmuel Kornitzer. He was the last Rav in Krakow. When the Nazis came into the city, with his naivety and tamimis, he went to the head of the Gestapo to ask him to treat the Jews with mercy in a humane fashion. He never came home. And 2 weeks later, his family got a box of ashes, and the Gestapo said, "This is your father." That's what they got. And he is buried next to his father, who was the Rav in Krakow before him. His ashes were buried, and there's a very moving mitzvah where they buried his ashes. So in those circumstances, it was clear that his ashes deserve to get a proper burial in Kavi soil, and my psak was the same with that other person. So today we discussed an extremely important halachic upcoming issue, and as I said at the beginning of this year, I had no intention of giving a definitive psak here. I'm just talking about the fundamentals and the interesting aspects of this shaila. So let us hope we'll have more Sheva Brochas questions and Shabbos questions than troubling questions. And we should always be able to help people. And once again, I thank Dr. Friedman and his entire staff. I know how much effort goes into a weekend like this. And I think it's a huge Kiddush Hashem, and the cooperation and collaboration between Rabbonim and doctors is so essential, because our people want to do everything in accordance to Das Torah. And once a year, we have a kenes in our Beis Medrash before Yom Kippur. I sit with a panel of doctors, and about 200 Rabbonim of Yerushalayim and other cities come together. And every year we choose a different medical topic, but we also open the floor for Rabbonim to ask questions. And I am very makbid. Doctors shouldn't give psak, and Rabbonim should not give medical advice. I know a tiny little bit more than the average Rav about medicine. I'm not a doctor. And I don't know nearly as much as even a resident. And I never give medical advice, never. Talk to your doctor, and if you don't understand what he's talking about, I'll talk to your doctor, and I give psak. And the same way, I don't like doctors giving piskei halacha. We both need to cooperate, and each of us needs to know exactly what is his field of expertise, and what is his call, and what is his responsibility. And therefore, I think that the cooperation between medical professionals and Rabbonim is essential, it's important, and that is one of the reasons I make an effort each and every year. Since the conception of this conference, I think I was here every year, and Bezrat Hashem, Lashon Habo B'Yushalayim.